The Yamnaya never built an empire. They built something more difficult to stop. About 5,000 years ago, communities of herders spread across the grasslands north of the Black and Caspian Seas. They had no capital, no written laws, no permanent army, and no emperor waiting in a palace. Most of what they owned could move on four legs or roll behind oxen. Yet within a few centuries, people carrying ancestry closely related to theirs appeared from the Danube to the Altai Mountains. Soon, much of Europe had been genetically transformed. Languages descended from the same ancient family would eventually be spoken from Ireland to India, and, much later, across most of the planet. The Yamnaya did not conquer all of that territory themselves. They started the chain reaction. Their real power was not one miracle weapon. It was a new way of organizing movement, food, family, status, and distance. They turned the open steppe from an empty barrier into a highway. And once human societies learned to move that way, the ancient world became much smaller. To understand how dramatic this was, remove almost everything normally associated with civilization. No roads, no engines, no maps, no refrigerated food, no weather forecast. A river 50 kilometers away is not a pleasant afternoon drive. It is another region. Europe around 3300 BCE was already full of people. Farmers had lived there for thousands of years. They grew crops, raised animals, built villages, traded stone and copper, and sometimes constructed enormous settlements. Hunter-gatherer communities still occupied parts of the north and east. The continent was not waiting empty for a heroic population to arrive and switch on history. Then, across the Pontic-Caspian steppe, stretching through parts of modern Ukraine, Russia, and neighboring lands, a distinctive archaeological horizon appeared. We call it Yamnaya. The name comes from a word for pit, because they often placed the dead in pits beneath earthen burial mounds known as Kurgans. Archaeologists first recognized them through these graves, pottery, tools, animal remains, and the enormous territory over which similar practices appeared. The people themselves did not wake up one morning and announce that Yamnaya culture had officially launched. Archaeological cultures are labels created by researchers. A similar burial custom does not prove that everyone shared one identity, obeyed one chief, or used the same word for breakfast. The Yamnaya Horizon contained regional groups, local traditions, and people whose lives changed over time. They were also not a pure population emerging from nowhere. Ancient DNA reveals ancestry formed through long contact among communities connected to Eastern European hunter-gatherers, the Caucasus, the lower Volga, and farming populations farther west and south. New genomic research places a major source of their ancestry in the Caucasus lower Volga region, with later mixing around the northern Black Sea and Dnipro-Don zones. Before the Yamnaya transformed Eurasia, Eurasia had already transformed them. That matters because their success came from combination. Steppe foragers knew rivers, grasslands, wild animals, and enormous seasonal landscapes. Farming and pastoral societies brought domesticated cattle, sheep, goats, food processing traditions, and new materials. Networks around the Caucasus connected the steppe with regions experienced in herding and metallurgy. The result was not simply a new tribe. It was a new operating system for the grasslands. The steppe looks easy to cross until a person actually tries. It offers huge grazing territory but few natural shelters. Water can be seasonal. Winters are severe. Summers can be dry. Herds consume the grass in one area and must be moved to another. A family tied permanently to one field cannot exploit the entire landscape. The Yamnaya solution was mobile pastoralism. Their wealth traveled as cattle, sheep, and goats. Animals converted grass humans could not eat into meat, fat, milk, hides, wool, bone, and traction. A herd was a pantry that walked, reproduced, and occasionally ignored instructions. Milk may have been especially important. Proteins preserved in ancient dental calculus show a striking expansion of dairy consumption among early Bronze Age steppe pastoralists. Many adults probably could not digest large amounts of fresh milk without discomfort because the genetic trait for lifelong lactase. Persistence was not yet common, but milk can be processed. Fermentation and separation create foods such as yogurt-like products, curds, cheese, and butter, reducing lactose, and making nutrients easier to store or transport. This did not make pastoralists independent of every crop or wild resource. It did give them a recurring supply of calories, protein, and fat without killing the animal producing it. A cow became food infrastructure. The next ingredient had wheels. Wheeled vehicles appeared in several parts of Eurasia before or around the rise of the Yamnaya. They did not invent the wheel, despite the ancient habit of assigning every useful object to one dramatic people. Their achievement was using wagons at a scale suited to life on the steppe. These were not light war chariots. Chariots appeared much later. Yamnaya wagons were heavy vehicles, probably drawn mainly by oxen. They could carry shelter materials, tools, food, vessels, children, and possessions that a walking family could not easily transport. The wagon changed the mathematics of migration. Without one, movement forces a brutal decision about what can be carried. With one, an entire household becomes more portable. Older people and young children can travel farther. Supplies can cross stretches where grazing or water is uncertain. A camp does not need to be rebuilt from nothing each time the herd moves. The wagon was slow. Slow is still revolutionary when it carries your house. Horses added another layer, but this is where the familiar story often becomes too cinematic. The Yamnaya were not an army of armored cavalry sweeping across Europe like an early trailer for the Mongols. Horse domestication had begun earlier, and the precise scale of Yamnaya riding remains debated. Skeletal changes found in some individuals are consistent with habitual riding, while other researchers warn that such marks are not exclusive proof. At minimum, horses were part of their world. Even limited riding would help people scout, communicate, and manage livestock over greater distances. But ox-drawn wagons and the pastoral economy were probably more important to moving whole communities than a warrior dramatically appearing on a ridge. History prefers the horse because the horse looks excellent in slow motion. The ox did much of the logistics. Mobility alone does not explain the expansion. People can travel enormous distances and accomplish nothing except becoming tired somewhere else. The Yamnaya also developed social systems that made movement sustainable. Pastoral households needed access to grazing land, water, marriage partners, allies, and information. They had to know where other groups were located, which routes were safe, and who would support them during conflict or scarcity. Kinship connected camps across distance. Feasts, exchanges, marriages, and obligations turned scattered households into networks. Those networks could expand without a central government. One family moved toward relatives. Another established a new grazing circuit. A younger generation split from an older one. Migrants mixed with local communities, recruited allies, or displaced competitors. The cultural frontier advanced through many decisions rather than one imperial command. This made the Yamnaya Horizon strangely scalable. An empire needs administrators, a pastoral network needs relatives, animals, and enough mutual understanding to avoid stealing the wrong cattle. Their burial mounds helped make the landscape social. A kurgan was not simply a place to dispose of a body. It was a monument visible across open country. Many Yamnaya graves placed an individual on the back with bent knees, sometimes covered in red ochre, beneath timber or stone arrangements and an earthen mound. Later burials could be inserted into existing mounds. These monuments linked people to ancestors and territory. A mobile society was not therefore rootless. Its roots were marked across the routes it traveled. The mound said someone important lay here. It may also have said the surrounding land was not available for casual subscription. Not everyone received the same burial. Differences in mound size, labor, grave construction, and offerings suggest status distinctions. Certain adult men appear especially prominent, and genetic evidence from later steppe-derived groups shows powerful male line expansions. This points toward societies in which some lineages gained extraordinary reproductive and political success. But graves exaggerate importance by design. Archaeologists see the people selected for memorable burial more easily than those whose remains disappeared. We should not reconstruct an entire society using only the Bronze Age equivalent of premium accounts. Women, children, herders, craftspeople, and less powerful families made mobility possible. Someone raised animals, processed milk, repaired wagons, prepared hides, taught routes, and maintained alliances. A famous man beneath a mound still required an entire living economy above it. Around the beginning of the 3rd millennium BCE, the system expanded with astonishing speed. To the east, populations genetically almost indistinguishable from Yamnaya groups appeared in the Altai region, associated with the Afanasyevo culture. The distance from the western steppe was several thousand kilometers. This was not a slow drift into the neighboring valley. It was one of prehistory's great long-range movements. To the west, Yamnaya groups entered the lower Danube and the Carpathian Basin. Their direct settlements and burials did not cover Europe uniformly. The larger transformation continued through communities associated with the corded ware complex, which spread across Central and Northern Europe beginning around 2900 BCE. And by the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Ancient DNA changed the argument. Before genomic evidence, archaeologists debated whether similarities in burials, axes, pottery, and social practices reflected migration, imitation, trade, or some mixture. Then researchers examined skeletons from late Neolithic and Bronze Age Europe. The result was not subtle. Early corded ware individuals carried large amounts of steppe-related ancestry. In one influential study, some could trace roughly 3/4 of their ancestry to a population related to Yamnaya. Over the following centuries, steppe ancestry spread widely through Europe. This did not mean every corded ware person was a Yamnaya migrant. Later research found early corded ware communities were genetically diverse and formed through mixture. Their precise source cannot always be reduced to the Yamnaya individuals already sampled. Steppe-related is a genetic relationship, not a passport stamped at one campsite. Still, the demographic shift was enormous. In Britain, a later movement associated with the Bell-Beaker complex replaced about 90% of the island's gene pool within several centuries. Those newcomers carried substantial steppe ancestry, but they arrived from continental Europe, not as a direct Yamnaya expedition from the Black Sea. By then, the original expansion had passed through multiple populations, cultures, and generations. The Yamnaya were less like one arrow crossing the map, and more like the first collision in a line of falling pieces. What happened to the people already living there? This is where the story becomes uncomfortable and uncertain. Population replacement can involve violence, but DNA does not record the cause of death in a caption. Archaeology reveals conflict and lethal injuries in Neolithic Europe before, during, and after the steppe migrations. Weapons existed. Communities competed for land and livestock. It would be naive to imagine that every encounter ended with a polite exchange of cheese. But the popular claim that Yamnaya warriors instantly killed nearly all European men is not established. Large ancestry changes can develop over centuries through migration, unequal survival, social status, disease, differences in fertility, and repeated absorption of local communities. Male-biased ancestry patterns suggest that men connected to steppe-derived groups often enjoyed greater reproductive success. That may reflect conquest and coercion in some places. It may also reflect marriage systems, inheritance, elite dominance, or the expansion of particular clans. The process differed by region. In some places, immigrant groups mixed extensively with locals. In others, ancestry changed sharply. Iberia later experienced a near-total replacement of local Y chromosome lineages, while much maternal ancestry continued, showing a profoundly male-biased transformation. Yet even that occurred after the initial Yamnaya Horizon, and cannot be converted into one universal invasion scene. Disease may have helped destabilize communities. Ancient strains of the plague bacterium, Yersinia pestis, circulated in Eurasia during the late Neolithic and Bronze Age. Some have proposed that epidemics weakened farming populations or traveled with mobile groups. The early strains and their transmission remain under study, however. Plague is a possible part of the story, not a tiny microbial lawyer clearing the Yamnaya of all other involvement. The demographic transformation was real. Its exact human experience was local, uneven, and probably sometimes brutal. Then came the transformation we can still hear. English, Spanish, Russian, Persian, Hindi, Greek, Armenian, and hundreds of other languages belong to the Indo-European family. Their similarities are not accidental. Words, sounds, and grammar can be systematically compared to reconstruct parts of an ancestral language normally called Proto-Indo-European. No Yamnaya person wrote it down. Writing had not reached the steppe. Linguists reconstruct it by comparing descendant languages, rather like rebuilding an unseen ancestor from a very large family whose members have spent 4,000 years changing their accents. For decades, scholars argued over where this language family began. One major model placed its homeland on the Pontic-Caspian steppe and connected its spread with pastoralist expansion. Another placed deeper origins among early farmers in Anatolia. Ancient DNA has not ended every dispute, but it has made the steppe impossible to ignore. The migrations match the later distribution of many Indo-European branches remarkably well. Steppe-related ancestry moved into Europe with populations likely involved in the ancestry of Germanic, Baltic, Slavic, Celtic, and Italic-speaking communities. Eastward, and later southward, steppe migrations contributed to populations associated with Indo-Iranian languages. But the neat sentence, "the Yamnaya invented Proto-Indo-European and spread every branch," is too simple. The Anatolian branch, which included Hittite, appears to have split early and may have reached Anatolia without Yamnaya ancestry. New genomic models locate the deeper Indo-Anatolian source around the Caucasus Lower Volga region. They then connect the ancestor of the non-Anatolian Indo-European branches more closely with populations of the Dnipro-Don region that helped form the Yamnaya. In other words, the Yamnaya were probably not the opening page of the language story. They were the page where it became extremely difficult to put the book down. Their mobility gave language a delivery system. When communities move in large numbers, establish dominant kin networks, and absorb outsiders, their language can spread far beyond their genes. Newcomers may marry local people. Local people may adopt the speech of groups controlling animals, routes, alliances, or status. Children grow up with mixed ancestry, but one everyday language. Language expansion does not require everyone to be killed. It requires the next generation to speak differently. The Yamnaya vocabulary likely reflected a pastoral world of cattle, sheep, wheels, wagons, kinship, exchange, sky, and ritual. We cannot assign every reconstructed word securely to them, and language does not fossilize beside pottery. Yet the overlap between linguistic reconstruction, archaeology, and migration is powerful. Their descendants and related steppe societies carried parts of this inheritance forward. Corded ware communities transformed Europe. Farther east, later cultures developed new forms of pastoralism, metallurgy, and warfare. The Sintashta world eventually produced true spoke-wheeled chariots around the early 2nd millennium BCE, roughly 1,000 years after the first Yamnaya expansion. This distinction matters. The Yamnaya had wagons. Their distant successors had chariots. Combining them is like crediting the first person who used a cart with inventing Formula One. Yet the later innovations emerged inside a connected steppe world the Yamnaya had helped create. Routes of movement stretched across Eurasia. Metal, animals, techniques, stories, and people circulated over distances that earlier communities rarely crossed at the same scale. The transformation also reached into human biology. Steppe ancestry remains substantial in many modern European populations and appears in varying degrees across parts of Central and South Asia. This ancestry did not replace everything before it. Modern populations are mixtures formed from hunter-gatherers, early farmers, steppe pastoralists, and many later migrations. Some traits shifted through natural selection after these mixtures. Variants affecting height, pigmentation, immunity, and the ability to digest milk changed in frequency across later populations. The Yamnaya themselves were not necessarily the pale, milk-digesting stereotype sometimes projected onto them. Lactase persistence became common in Europe only after continued selection during and after the Bronze Age. They helped create the environment in which drinking animal milk was useful. Evolution handled the stomach complaint later. Their social legacy is harder to isolate. Later Indo-European speaking societies often emphasized patriarchal households, male warrior status, heroic reputation, cattle wealth, hospitality, oath-making, and sky-associated gods. Comparisons among ancient myths reveal intriguing shared structures and related divine names. But culture is not a sealed package carried unchanged for millennia. Greek, Vedic, Roman, Celtic, and Norse traditions developed among different peoples who absorbed enormous local influence. We cannot look at Zeus, Thor, or a heroic cattle raid, and treat it as live footage from a Yamnaya camp. What survived was not a frozen religion. It was a collection of patterns repeatedly rebuilt. That may be the deepest reason the Yamnaya transformed the ancient world. Their expansion was not a single conquest with a clear ending. It generated descendants, hybrids, successors, and competitors. Each inherited parts of the system and changed them. The Yamnaya showed that a mobile pastoral society could connect an enormous grassland corridor. Their wagons made households portable. Livestock turned grass into transportable wealth. Dairying stretched the value of each animal. Horses increased speed and control even before cavalry. Kinship extended cooperation beyond one camp. Burial mounds claimed memory across the landscape. Elite lineages multiplied. Language traveled with the network. None of those ingredients alone was enough. Together, they changed the scale of human movement. The old world had been organized largely around rivers, coasts, fields, and permanent settlements. The Yamnaya made the spaces between settlements powerful. A grassland once treated as a border became the center of a new system. That system could move faster than a village could react. It could survive where crops failed. It could split, expand, and reconnect. And because it carried families rather than only raiding parties, it did not merely visit new territory, it reproduced there. This is why calling them warriors explains too little. Weapons may win an encounter. They do not feed children through winter, move a household 200 kilometers, maintain herds, arrange marriages, or preserve alliances across generations. The Yamnaya advantage was logistical before it was military. Their most important vehicle was not the wagon. It was the society the wagon allowed. By around 2500 BCE, the classic Yamnaya Horizon was already giving way to successor cultures. They did not survive as one named people marching through recorded history. No Yamnaya king introduced himself to a scribe. No monument lists their victories. Their identity dissolved into the transformations they had begun. Yet their impact remained inside millions of bodies, across an entire family of languages, and within the connected Bronze Age world that followed. They did not create Europe. They did not erase everyone who came before. They did not invent every technology later associated with the steppe. And they did not personally ride from Ukraine to India handing out identical gods. What they did was more believable and more extraordinary. They inherited animals, wheels, metals, roots, and traditions from many earlier peoples. They combined them into a mobile way of life capable of expanding across the largest continuous grassland system on Earth. Their descendants mixed with farmers, foragers, and other pastoralists, creating new peoples who continued moving. The genetic map changed. The language map changed. The meaning of distance changed. 5,000 years later, a speaker in Manila can use English words whose deepest relatives also appear in Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, Persian, and languages spoken across Europe and Asia. The connection is not proof that one Yamnaya dictionary survived intact. It is the echo of countless migrations, marriages, conquests, adoptions, and childhood conversations set in motion by the steppe expansion. The Yamnaya left no empire because an empire would have been smaller than their legacy. Their cities cannot be excavated because mobility was their architecture. Their chronicles cannot be read because other people eventually wrote in languages shaped by the world they helped create. They disappeared? The transformation did not.